అందరికీ స్వాగతం. ఈరోజు వెబినార్ లో కామ్రేడ్ కిరణ్ మోగే గారు పూణే నుంచి మాట్లాడతారు. ఈరోజు మనం చర్చించబోయేటువంటి అంశము మానవ హక్కులు, ఆహార భద్రత. ఈరోజు మానవ హక్కుల దినం, ప్రపంచ మానవ హక్కుల దినం. మానవ హక్కుల్లో ఒకటి జీవించే హక్కు. జీవించాలంటే ఆహారం కావాల్సిందే. అందుకని ఆహారానికి భద్రత కల్పించడం అనేటువంటిది ప్రభుత్వాల బాధ్యతగా ఉండాలి. ఇతర హక్కులతో పాటు ప్రాథమికమైనటువంటి బాధ్యత ఆహార భద్రత కల్పించటం. కానీ ఆహార భద్రతకి సమస్య వచ్చేటువంటి అంశం ఇప్పుడు కనిపిస్తున్నది. ముఖ్యంగా వ్యవసాయ బిల్లుల్లో అటువంటి అంశాలు మనకు కనపడుతున్నాయి. సో ఈరోజు మానవ హక్కుల రోజు కనుక మానవ హక్కులు, ఆహార భద్రత అనే అంశం మీద చర్చ ఉంటుంది. ముందుగా కిరణ్ మోగే గారు, ఆమె లండన్ స్కూల్ ఆఫ్ ఎకనామిక్స్ నుంచి ఆమె ఎంఎస్సి చేశారు ఎకనామిక్స్ లో. దానికి ముందు ఆమె పూణే ఫెర్గ్యూసన్ కళాశాల నుంచి గ్రాడ్యుయేషన్ చేశారు ఎకనామిక్స్ లో, ఎకనామిక్స్ ఆనర్స్. ఆ తర్వాత పోస్ట్ గ్రాడ్యుయేషన్ తర్వాత ఆమె అనేక ప్రభుత్వ సంస్థల్లోనూ ఎన్జిఓ సంస్థల్లో కూడా పనిచేశారు. మహిళా ఉద్యమంలో పనిచేయడానికి ఆమె వాటిని వదిలిపెట్టి మహిళా ఉద్యమంలోకి వచ్చారు. ఐద్వా జాతీయ కార్యదర్శిగా, అదేవిధంగా ఐద్వా మహారాష్ట్ర ప్రధాన కార్యదర్శిగా పనిచేశారు. అనేక ట్రేడ్ యూనియన్లో కూడా, అంగన్వాడీ తదితర ట్రేడ్ యూనియన్లో కూడా ఆమె నాయకత్వం వహిస్తున్నారు. మొదట ఆమె 45 నిమిషాలు ఈ అంశం మీద మాట్లాడతారు. దాన్ని కామ్రేడ్ మల్లారెడ్డి గారు, కిసాన్ సభ ఆల్ ఇండియా ఉపాధ్యక్షులు, వారు దాన్ని సమప్ చేసి తెలుగులో చెప్తారు. ఆ తర్వాత ప్రశ్నలు కూడా మీరు అడగవచ్చు. ఆమె మాట్లాడుతున్నప్పుడు కూడా ఫేస్బుక్ మీద మీరు మీ ప్రశ్నల్ని కామెంట్ కాలంలో నమోదు చేయవచ్చు. వాటిని ఆ తర్వాత నేను ఇంగ్లీష్లోకి ట్రాన్స్లేట్ చేసి చెప్తాను. ఆమె వాటికి సమాధానాలు చెప్తారు. ఇంగ్లీష్లో ప్రశ్నలు అడగలిగినటువంటి వాళ్ళు ఇంగ్లీష్లోనే తమ ప్రశ్నల్ని నమోదు చేయవచ్చు. ఇప్పుడు నేను ఐఎమ్ రిక్వెస్టింగ్ కామ్రేడ్ మోగే టు స్టార్ట్ హర్ స్పీచ్. థ్యాంక్ యూ.
Thank you very much, comrade. And I just wanted to say that I feel very honored that the Sundarayya Vignana Kendra has invited me to speak today on this occasion of Human Rights Day. I have had the opportunity to visit the Sundarayya Vignana Kendra several times when I was especially an office bearer in ADWA and for other meetings, and I have visited your library and I have seen some of the activities that are going on there, the exhibitions that you have organized, and it is a beautiful center. So I feel I want to say my deepest thanks to you for inviting me. I also have a small association with Hyderabad. My father was posted there many years ago. So I used to live in that city and went to school there for some years. So I feel a special affinity with all of you. So thank you very much. As we all know, today is being observed as Human Rights Day in the entire world. And we all, believe that amongst the basic fundamental needs of all human beings, which are required to lead what we shall call a dignified and a decent life, we would say that food, shelter, clothing, and today we add to that health and education are basic fundamental rights of the people. And so it's very appropriate that today we are discussing the question of food and food security on this day. It is, of course, something that we all need to think about, that despite the fact that we have made so much progress as human beings, as humankind in this world over the last so many centuries, and especially in the last 100, 150 years, so much of scientific progress, where we have captured outer space and we have come to know about so many things about the material world in which we live in. And despite all that, we are unable, in a sense, to solve the problem of hunger. And even today, the United Nations and all the world's countries, governments, ultimately have to set themselves a goal, which is of ending hunger. And all the Millennium Development Goals and all the Sustainable Development Goals always put the whole question of ending hunger and providing food security to everyone as their number one objective. And obviously, I mean, for us, we can understand that it is basically because despite all this progress, the capitalist part of development that most countries, except the socialist countries, have adopted, has actually led to this situation where every time in this system, it is profit that is put over people. And so we continue to struggle with this whole question of hunger and hunger alleviation. And therefore, the question of food and food as a basic right, as a basic human right, remains a central question that confronts most of the countries in the world today, including ours. The second point that I want to make is that it is, of course, highly appropriate that today we are discussing this whole question of food security in the background of this amazing historical struggle that is being waged by our farmers, who are actually our food producers across the country at the moment. And so I would like to take this opportunity with all of you to express once again our solidarity with this struggle and support them in their effort to have these 3 laws that this Modi government has passed in the most undemocratic manner on the strength of their brute majority, without any kind of discussion, flouting all democratic and parliamentary norms. And of course, the farmers are in struggle and we are with them. But I mean, the point is that actually these very acts are going to fundamentally affect the food security of our country. And so I feel that it is really appropriate that we are discussing this question today. Of course, what I will do is I will take up that point at the very end of my talk. And I would really first like to start by all of us having a common understanding of what we mean by food security and the concept of food security. You see, most people tend to equate food security with the public distribution system, the ration system as we call it. And this is particularly true because we have now in our country a National Food Security Act that was passed in 2013. And a large number of us through different mass and class organizations were actually involved trying to get that act passed in a manner that was beneficial to most of the people of our country. So there is a tendency to think of, when you think of food security, to think of the public distribution system. But I want to at this point say that though the public distribution system is very much a very important part of the food security system of any country, and our country in particular, food security is not just about the public distribution system. It is much, much more. And there are 3 or 4 aspects of food security that we really need to keep in mind. The first is that food security is about adequate nutrition, in the sense that we as human beings need, we have physical bodily requirements in terms of energy. Okay, so the first aspect of food security is adequate nutrition. And this nutrition that we require varies according to where we are in our human life cycle. As children, we have different nutritional needs. As pregnant mothers, we have different nutritional needs. As working people, we have different nutritional needs. As elderly, we have different nutritional needs. And science and nutritional experts have today worked out,
what are these nutritional standards that are required. And therefore, having these adequate nutritional standards is very much part of food security. And let us say that eating junk food and being obese is also about food insecurity, and that is something that we must keep in mind. So, different societies with different cultural practices try and source different types of food, which is why, in the concept of food security, we must also respect cultural diversity in food. And today, of course, we have a party in power and certain organizations that are trying to impose certain cultural norms on us about vegetarian and non-vegetarian and not eating beef and not eating eggs in the midday meal scheme, etc. But I think this is something that we also need to keep in point. And especially in a country like India, which has such a huge biodiversity, we can meet our nutritional needs through a culturally diverse set of food that is actually available to us. But the point is that it's not just about nutrition, but of course, food security is also about having adequate production of these different types of food. So the production aspect of food security, which has to do with the land, with water, with other types of inputs. I mean, food can be acquired from the sea, it can be acquired from the river, it can be acquired from land. There are different cropping patterns. And of course, in a market system, there is the question of procuring this food, pricing it, distributing it. So that is also an aspect of food security that we need to keep in mind. But the third and most important point is that nutritional sources are available. They may be produced. The point is, it may even be produced in adequate numbers. But the question is it accessible and affordable to those people who need it? And we all know about Professor Amartya Sen and some of his pioneering work, which was on the Bengal famines in the pre-independence times. Professor Sen actually pointed out that during the famines, it was not so much the lack of production of food that was a cause for that widespread hunger at that time, but it was actually the inability of most of the working people to actually access that food because they had no work and they had no purchasing power. And so one must understand that in a sense, food security is not about just the production of food, but it is also the ability to access it, either by working, earning, and then buying it, or by some other means through maybe a welfare system. And the last aspect of food security, I think, that we need to keep in mind is that a food security system has to be sustainable. Because if there is no food, there is no life. So ultimately, we have to put in a system that will reproduce itself and will be viable and sustainable. So it's in this, it's all these different dimensions that I think we have to look at the question of food security. And then we also have to think in terms of whether we are talking about the food security of an individual, whether we are talking about the food security of a family, or whether we are talking about the food security of a country. And therefore, one must also understand, and as we will speak in the course of what I am speaking to you, that the whole question of food security has not just national, but also international dimension. And so I think this is what I really wanted to contextualize the way in which we approach the whole question of food and food security. So now coming to our own country, what do we think is the status of food security of the people of India today? I mean, as activists or as people working with social movements or as simply sensitive human beings, of course, we understand and we can see around us that there is widespread hunger and malnutrition. And, we know that obviously most people in our country remain food insecure. And this really came to the fore in the last 6 months when all of us have been experiencing this COVID pandemic, and particularly with the migrant workers. And most of us, I think, who are involved in any kind of relief work, a lot of that relief work was actually about delivering food and trying to help people who were without food for several reasons, whether it was through community kitchens or whether it was through supplying them with dry ration kits. But food was actually something that was so central, in a sense, to all our relief efforts. So we know that there is food insecurity in our country. And in fact, in September was observed in many Anganwadi centers and by the governments, several state and even the central governments, as National Nutrition Month. So all around us, we see that there is...
I said that the month of September was National Nutrition Month, and the government actually ran a campaign called Poshan Abhiyan throughout the country. And the United Nations has recently put out a report, the Food and Agricultural Organization, which tells us that in terms of achieving what is known as the goal number 2 of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is zero hunger, that about 14% of India's population is malnourished or undernourished. That means about 20 crores of people. And that India is home to the highest number of malnourished children. 35% of our children below the 5 years are stunted. 20% are below the age of 5 are wasted, and that this is a serious problem. Now, if some of our people don't believe in international statistics, let's look at the National Family Health Survey, which has done several rounds. And the last round, of course, was in 2015-16. But what does it show us? It shows us that anemia in children is about 58%. That anemia in women is in the age group 15 to 49 years is 53%. That the percentage of underweight children in our country below the age of 5 is 36%. And children who are stunted. What does stunting mean? It means that your height is too low for your age. That is 36%. And if you're wasted, it means that your weight is too low for your height. That is 21%. Now, for us, sometimes when we hear these figures, what do they mean? Can we actually understand what these figures mean? We tend to read these indices. We say that in the global... So I was just giving these figures and saying that, for instance, they say that there is something called the Global Hunger Index. And of the 117 countries that are part of that index, 102 is what we are at. And in South Asia, a country like Nepal is at 74, Bangladesh is at 88, Pakistan is at 94. We always have terrible things to say about these countries otherwise. But the point is that as far as these kind of indices are concerned, we are way below most of the countries in the world. Now, the point I was making is that when we listen to all these figures, sometimes they just seem to go over our head. What does 36%, 21%, 53% mean? But really, when you think about it, what it means is that half our children and women, particularly, go to bed without a full meal in their stomach. It means that it affects their future development. We know for children in particular, the age group 0 to 3 and then 3 to 6, in the sense 0 to 6 is a critical age group. And if they do not get adequate nutrition, it affects them for life. It affects their educational development. It means future generations of this country are being severely affected. And when we are saying that 50% of our women, and particularly 50% of our pregnant women are anemic, it means that before the child is born, it is actually being undernourished. So can you imagine what it is doing to generations and generations of our people in our country? So this is a very, very serious issue. And we all know that, we have had hunger deaths in our country. And we all remember those stories where, we have it has been reported that people are eating rats in Bihar or trying to find grass in Rajasthan and Orissa and survive. And so this whole question of hunger and food insecurity, I think, has to be viewed in a very human perspective. Sometimes when we are thrown these figures, we don't understand what it really means. But we know that particularly in our patriarchal family systems, when we are saying that children and women are malnourished, men are also malnourished, the percentage of anemic men in our country is also not small. It is something like 23 to 25%, which means 1 in 4 men also do not get enough malnourishment. But it's just the structure of the family, which means that the men eat first, then the male child, then the female child, and finally, if there is anything left over, it is for the women. The point I want to make here is that when one looks at all this data, what is striking is, and particularly from the National Family Health Survey, we don't find a great deal changing as far as these figures are concerned. Yes, there has been some decline in malnourishment, no doubt. And of course, programs like the ICDS and the midday meal scheme and all these programs have made some improvement, have led to some improvement. But still half the population remains malnourished in this critical period. And I think that is something that we have to keep in mind and understand, that especially in the context of COVID, when now COVID has brought to a halt many of these nutritional programs for different reasons, when people are unemployed, the question of malnutrition and food insecurity is going to be something that is going to be intensified in the coming period. Now the question is why? Especially in a country like India, which has such rich biodiversity, and where we otherwise pride ourselves by saying that we are the second highest producers of wheat, of rice, of sugarcane. We produce so many vegetables, we have groundnut, fruits, milk, pulses. I mean, there is nothing that this country doesn't produce and cannot produce because of its climatic and other conditions. And at this point in time, we have huge stocks of food grain sitting in the FCI godowns, something like 7.5 crore metric tons. So the point is that why do we continue to have such high levels of malnutrition? And there comes the question of access. That obviously people do not have the capacity to buy whatever is being produced. And that is because, again, it is poverty and unemployment which are the major factors that are leading to food insecurity. So, really speaking, when we talk about food security, it's not just about food, but we also have to talk about work. And that is why many of us have always campaigned not just for the right to food, but also for the right to work. Now, unemployment and employment is a big, big question in this country, and I'm not going into those details because that is something that will take up more than an hour of our time. But I think what we need to really understand, therefore, is that the food security system has to be viewed in a holistic manner and cannot be viewed in a piecemeal way, and not only in terms of production of food or distribution of food, but actually how you access it. And work and employment actually constitutes also a very important aspect of food security, but that is something that I'm going to leave for the time being. I will now quickly move, therefore, to the point that if people themselves, because of all these reasons, do not have the capacity to buy, then it is the duty of the state to step in, because we are talking about food as a human right. And so if it is the right of the people, and for some particular reason, as we are saying, given the nature of development that has taken its course, people aren't able to access that food, then those sections of people who are not able to access the very basic fundamental right need to be helped to access it. And that is where the public distribution system in our country has played a very big role. And we all know that particularly at the time after we became independent, especially during the 60s, there were food shortages. We were a newly emerging independent country. You know, our systems were still not in place. And then, of course, we had a foreign exchange crisis. We were not able to we had great difficulty importing food, and we had to depend on, let us say, the charity of the Western nations at that time. It also became a geopolitical issue, the PL 480 crisis that many of us know about. And so it is in that context, really. And at that time, the development paradigm in our country, which actually was in favor of providing welfare benefits to the people, unlike the neoliberal paradigm of today, which led to the setting up of the public distribution system in India. Of course, the public distribution system in India goes back to wartime period in our country before independence, when the ration system, as it was called particularly, was set up in all the major cities because there were food shortages at that time during the war, the First and the Second World War. But basically that developed into what we call the public distribution system today. And the major objectives of the PDS when it was set up was actually to provide a system whereby on one hand the government would procure at minimum support prices from the farmers, so provide a kind of an assured market for farmers on one hand, and through the entire system of the Food Corporation of India, finally route all that was procured into these fair price shops or ration shops as we call them, and would make available food grains particularly and other essential commodities as we were demanding at controlled prices through the public distribution system. And this public distribution system was therefore set up during the 60s. In 64, 65, we had the setting up of the Food Corporation of India. And then, of course, we had the market systems that were set up, the APMCs that are under discussion today. And overall, if we see that for about a period of between, say, 1965 and 1990, this system functioned more or less differently in different parts of the country, depending very much on, the political will, in a sense, of the state governments that were actually implementing them. So you had a much better system, say, in Kerala and in many of the southern states, including Andhra Pradesh at that time, as it was called, in Tamil Nadu, in Karnataka. But it was rather poorly implemented in many of the northern states. And so you had a very mixed system, which of course needed much more strengthening. But what happened with the structural adjustment policies, the new economic policies, with the introduction of neoliberal policies in the 1990s, is that this whole orientation towards reducing public expenditure, and particularly the fiscal deficit, which meant government expenditure needed to be reduced. And in that, one of the things that became the centerpiece of this whole reduction in public expenditure was whatever was being spent on the food subsidy, which was really, what shall we say, the difference between what the government was paying the farmers plus whatever their costs were for the distribution and storage through the food corporation, and then selling it at a cheaper price to people with ration cards. So this margin, this difference in expenditure, which we call the food subsidy, became, as I said, the target of these neoliberal policies. And in fact, it has changed, because even today, food subsidies are actually less than 1% of our GDP. I think about 0.5 to 0.6%, and have probably gone down over the last few years. And it is barely 2.5% of the total expenditure of the central government. So even then, it became a soft target, I would say, of the government. And the government decided to basically reorient this entire public distribution system. And what did they do? Basically, they increased prices on the public distribution system. They targeted the public distribution system, which was otherwise a universal system, and said, well, only people who are supposedly below the poverty line will be able to access cheap food through the PDS. And they also reduced the quotas that were being given to people. And as a result of all this, basically what happened is that more and more people were thrown out of the public distribution system, basically because they now divided all the needy people into the, all the poor, in a sense, were divided into the more poor, the very poor, and the less poor, which is, as you will all agree, quite a ridiculous way of doing it in a country where, by and large, most people are undernourished and need a food security system. But this was what the neoliberal policy was trying to do. On one hand, the first target was to reduce food subsidies. And on the other hand, of course, the target was to try and open up, and that is what exactly they are doing with the farm laws now, to try and open up the entire food system of our country to multinational corporations that have been involved in food trade over the last so many years. So weaken the public distribution system on one hand, and then open up the market for food on the other hand, was basically the strategy that was devised by those, all our ruling classes at that time. Now, the point is that there was a struggle. The government was trying to reduce the scope of the public distribution system on one hand, and organizations, people's organizations, working class organizations, women's organizations, farmers, peasants, agricultural labor, all of us who depend on the food public distribution system and could understand its importance in the food security of our country, were actually, trying to retain it. And in that struggle emerged this whole concept of the National Food Security Act, which we know was passed in 2013. And that was at the very end of the second UPA government. And there was a big debate about it. And unfortunately, the act that was passed, though we as organizations were asking for a universal, strengthened public distribution system that would give food virtually free, in the sense at very cheap prices, to almost anybody who required it, saying that people would self-exclude. Actually, that kind of an act did not come into place. What we got again was an act which in fact institutionalized this whole concept of targeting what they call the very poor, and targeting them on the basis of some fraudulent poverty line, which is very difficult to estimate in a country like ours, where so many people work in the unorganized sector, where people are, do not have regular jobs throughout the year. And so as a result, what we got was a strange National Food Security Act, which calls itself national, which calls itself a Food Security Act, but actually has reduced the food security of the people by throwing them out of the purview of this act. The government took 2 or 3 decisions. One, it decided that only 75% of the people in rural areas and 50% in urban areas would be eligible, and put out lists. That was one. Secondly, it reduced the quota of cereals, for instance, that would be available on the ration shops to only 5 kilos per person. And secondly, though they may have reduced prices, the manner in which the eligibility criteria was worked out meant that most people went out of the system. And then there was a whole manner in which the ration cards were to be linked to the Aadhaar cards, they were to be linked to the banks, and in this process, they were to be linked to the mobiles. And in this process, what really happened is that most eligible people got excluded from this system. And today, when you go to any area and you ask about what are the problems of people, most people tell us that one of the problems that they face is that they are unable to access the public distribution system. So this is one part of it. The second aspect is that since food security, of course, is a wider concept than just the ration shops, due to our efforts, there were certain other things that were also included as part of the act. For instance, maternity benefits was part of the National Food Security Act. The Integrated Child Development Services, which is the Anganwadi scheme, was part of the act. The midday meal scheme was also brought into the ambit of the act. But today what we see successively We saw it during the period of the UPA, but especially after the Modi government came to power from 2014. Despite the act being passed, really speaking, whether it is ICDS, whether it is the midday meal scheme, all these schemes have seen successive reductions in budgetary allocations. And in fact, during the entire pandemic, the midday meal scheme just didn't function. Even the ICDS functioned with great difficulty. And the Maternity Benefit Act, it is strange that the government has one scheme which is called the Janani Suraksha Yojana, which actually gives 6,000 rupees as maternity benefit up to 2 children. But the maternity benefit that is prescribed in the National Food Security Act is only 5,000 and up to 1 child. So this entire act is actually a misnomer. It doesn't provide any food security, and it is full of errors of exclusion, full of problems of targeting, and the main thing is that it has divided the poor. And in this background, after the passage of the act and its very shoddy implementation, as we have seen, and an effort to actually weaken it at every stage, we saw that the government set up, the Modi government set up in 2014 what is called the Shanta Kumar Samiti, the Shanta Kumar Committee. And the Shanta Kumar Committee is now being discussed at great length because these 3 acts that we know that have been passed by Parliament are actually much in consonance with the Shanta Kumar Committee. But what were the recommendations of the Shanta Kumar Committee? And I'm saying this because I want to link it now at the end to the 3 acts that have been passed, or the Agriculture Act. The Shanta Kumar Committee actually made a recommendation. It said that, first of all, there's too much food grains lying with the Food Corporation of India, not realizing that the food grains were lying with the Food Corporation of India, not because people didn't want to buy them, but because people had been excluded from the public distribution system. So though they wanted to access them, they were actually not able to get to them. And it was the rats that were getting to them, or it was being exported as cattle feed by by successive governments over the years. So the Shanta Kumar Committee said, oh, there's too much food lying in the Food Corporation of India godowns. You have to do something about it. You have to actually privatize, in a way, the whole Food Corporation of India system. You have to rationalize its storage systems. You have to reduce its staff. And really speaking, even this public distribution system needs to be rationalized. Reduce the number of priority households. That means the households that are eligible for the PDS. What we were saying, what we had in the Act from 75% in rural and 50% in urban areas, the Shanta Kumar Committee actually recommended that there should be a reduction to 40%, which means that more people would go out of the system. And the second and most crucial and a dangerous recommendation that it made was that we should link the price of food grains that are made available on the public distribution system to the declared minimum support price. Now, of course, whether there will be a minimum support price now that these agriculture acts have been passed is a different matter. But please understand that reduction in the number of eligible families and, in a sense, increasing the prices of food available on the public distribution system would mean that more and more people would be excluded. And in a sense, that would lead to further rising stocks of food grains, which then the government would say that nobody is buying, so we may as well open up this market or even export them. And the third thing that the Shanta Kumar Committee recommended was there should be outsourcing of the storage of food grains by the Food Corporation of India. Now we can see all that coming into play. So now at the end of it, what I'm trying to say is that we had a public distribution system that was set up as a measure of food security for the welfare of the poor people in our country. During the 60s, when we faced food shortages, and through the whole process of Green Revolution, of the setting up of the FCI, we may have our own problems with all of that. But the point is that we had reached a stage where we were self-sufficient in food grains in a certain sense of the word. Of course, whether that self-sufficiency would have been correct or not, if everybody had access to that food, is something which is different. But the point is that we had enough buffer stocks which could be called upon to feed our people, as we could see during this pandemic. But with the advent of neoliberal policies in our country, since 1991, there has been a systematic devaluation of the public distribution system. It has been systematically dismantled by reducing its access, the people's access to the PDS, and making it more and more exclusive, in a sense, excluding more and more people out of it, which has, of course, then had its own impact, whether it is on women, whether it is on Dalit households, whether it is on Adivasis, whether it is on agricultural workers. All the working poor in our country have been deeply affected, and there is a lot of data to show us about that. I'm not going into the great details of it. I'll just come to the last point, which is about the current controversy about these acts and the farmers' struggle, and how, as I said in the beginning, it is not just a question of farmers, it is actually something that is going to deeply affect the food security of all of us and of the nation as a whole. Because the three acts that have been put in place, and which the government insists that it will continue with, despite the fact that there is so much pressure from the farmers to repeal them, what do they actually do? The first act, which is the FPTC Act, which is about putting into place an alternative private market system, along with the agricultural price market committees, is agricultural produce market committees, is actually something that is going to do away with public procurement of food in our country. If you do not have the APMCs, and farmers are going to be lured, in a sense, in the early stages to go and sell their produce in the private markets, then where is the government going to procure from? And if there is no procurement, obviously there is nothing that the Food Corporation of India will have. Yes, to some extent we have certain food stocks. These will slowly be used up, and there will come a point in our country when the Food Corporation of India will have nothing to provide in the public distribution system. So for us, the aspect of the public distribution system, which is a critical part of our food security system, is going to be deeply affected. And therefore, the passage of these acts is not just to the detriment of farmers. Those issues are there, and I'm not going into that. But from the point of view of ordinary working people who need access to cheaper food grains and through the public distribution system, this particular act is actually going to be the death knell of the public distribution system in our country. That's point number one. Point number two, the second act, which encourages contract farming. In a sense, what it means is that this rich cultural and biodiversity in food that we have had as a country is going to be destroyed, because private contract traders, farmers, companies, corporates who will get into these kind of contracts will be asking for a particular type of food product. Yeah, so it's like PepsiCo will be asking farmers to produce a certain type of potato because they want to make potato chips. But what about the food that you and me eat, the rice and the dal and the vegetables that we want for everyday consumption? If these are going to be the type of private contracts that are going to be got into by these large companies. And don't forget that these are companies that are sourcing countries like ours to provide for the needs and for the taste of people who are living internationally in different parts of the world. Then it's very possible that the diverse food production system in our country will become some kind of a monoculture, whereby we will not be able to have the kind of food that we want to eat, but will be dependent entirely on these companies to provide whatever they want us to eat. And so that is going to really, in a sense, affect our nutrition security. And that is a point that we have to keep in mind. And the third and the last point, that the amendment to the Essential Commodities Act, which is a critical part of our food security system, is going to be destroyed, because private contract traders, farmers, which has also been, the Essential Commodities Act has also been, in a sense, something that has helped to control food prices in our country. The Essential Commodities Act imposes stocking limits on all essential commodities, and the government can do price control by using the act. Today, the amendment to the Essential Commodities Act has meant that critically, please note the commodities that have gone out, the essential commodities that have gone out of the act: cereals, pulses, oil seeds, edible oil, onions, and potatoes, all which are part of our daily life and which we have seen in the last few years have seen skyrocketing prices. We will remember, all of us, how the price of tur dal went up to 200, 250 rupees a kilo, how onions and potatoes, periodically go up to 100 rupees a kilo. By removing the stocking limits and taking these commodities out of the Essential Commodities Act, what the government has actually done is, keep the private, food market open for all kinds of food speculation, price speculation, which is going to affect the food security of our country. So I just want to make the last point today, that the struggle of the farmers that we are supporting and we are seeing today is not just about keeping the farming community alive. Like, we've seen those little posters which say, no food, no farmer, no food. It is a struggle for the food security of our country, of our people. And in a sense, it is a struggle for the sovereignty of our people, of our country. The right to take our own decisions about what we eat, how we produce it. And why should it be that multinationals like Cargill and Syngenta and Pepsi and Walmart, and of course our own corporates like Reliance and all these big malls, why should they be the ones who will decide what we are going to eat and what kind of nutrition that we are going to get? So, comrades, I think these are the challenges that we are facing in terms of food security of our country today. And I think it is appropriate that on this occasion of Human Rights Day that we are celebrating, we once again assert that food security, nutrition security, and the right to determine what we want to eat, how much to eat, and if we are unable for some reason to access it, that it is the duty of the state to provide our food security, is something that we should, all of us, assert once again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Comrade. Before Comrade Nala sum it up in Telugu, I would like to bring to your notice, we are very fortunate to have Mr. K.R. Venugopal, retired IAS officer, online.
Yes, I know.
The gentleman who is seen on the screen is none than Mr. K.R. Venugopal. K.R. Venugopal has meticulously planned the 2 rupees rice scheme in NTR government. He was government secretary to N.T. Ramarao, and he has overseen it, effective implementation, execution of this scheme. So he is now among us. He may convey his opinions later on, but now I will ask Comrade Mallareddy to sum it up in Telugu. Mallareddy garu.
వేణుగోపాల్ గారిని మాట్లాడమనండి.
సార్ మీరేమన్నా తెలుగులోనే మాట్లాడతారు.
వేణుగోపాల్ గారు మాట్లాడిన తర్వాత నేను మాట్లాడతాను.
సార్ తెలుగులో మాట్లాడతారా? వేణుగోపాల్ గారు. లేదు సార్, మీరు మైక్ ఆన్లోనే, ఒకసారి మైక్ టచ్ చేయండి కర్సర్తో. లేదు సార్, రావట్లేదు. ఐ థింక్ మీరు మళ్ళీ ఇప్పుడు మైక్ ఆన్ చేయండి. కర్సర్తో మైక్ నొక్కండి. మాట్లాడండి.
ఇప్పుడు వినిపిస్తోందా?
ఇప్పుడు వినిపిస్తుంది సార్.
థ్యాంక్ యూ. First of all, I am very grateful to Ms. Moghe, who gave us a brilliant lecture and covering all the points. And there is nothing that was not covered by her. And it will be very beneficial if the entire thing is recorded and circulated amongst all the human rights defenders and workers, so that the fundamental of all rights in the world, which is the right to food, can continue to get advocated. And if we don't have that fundamental right, life itself is affected, and therefore Article 21 will get affected. And on this day, the Human Rights Day, we have to start with that right, number one. Now, I only have one or two suggestions which should be included, which is, Madam could have included the right to information, not in the sense of you wanting to know what the government does or not, but right to information as a fundamental necessity in the context of human rights, and also in the context of all the very many points that you made. Without right to information, Madam, food security will not be a reality. In fact, food security, in my opinion, is part of the larger issue of nutrition security. Nutrition security is not part of food security, but food security is part of nutrition security. Food security, as Dr. Gopalan once said, was about quantity, but nutrition security is about quality. The first is about hunger, the second is about hidden hunger, so we have to address both. Not that you didn't address, you have done everything. These are only in addition to what you said, man. By no means do I disagree with you. And I particularly congratulate you for having challenged the 2013 Food Act. It's a classic example of how bad laws cannot be implemented well. And in fact, if you implement a bad law well, then that means you are only perpetuating all that is bad and all that is anti-rights. Now, I would like to add to your analysis of the 2013 Act to point out there is a force majeure clause, Section 44, if my memory serves me right, in the Food Security Act of 2013. It says all those rights which are given in that act will not become applicable if there is a flood, if there is an earthquake, and so there are so many conditions there. It is only when there are floods, it's only when there is an earthquake, only if there are situations
or a pandemic.
Or a pandemic. That is when you need food security. But that act, it is such a ridiculously phrased act. I can't believe that there could be a force majeure act where human rights are concerned as fundamental as food and nutrition.
Very correct.
Secondly, Madam, agriculture was totally neglected in that 2013 Act. Totally. I think it was Schedule 2 or 3 which spoke about it. But it spoke about railway wagons to transport food instead of talking about farmers, instead of talking about their fundamental interests. And I completely agree with you in this context that when it comes to human rights, when it comes to right to food, it is the lead role of the state that is fundamentally required. That is the sine qua non. It is the duty of the state to provide the rights, to guarantee the rights, and to protect the rights. That point that you made requires highlighting, and without the state taking the lead, I don't see how any human rights could be there. Madam, I have one point about the targeting point. I have always had a difference, with those who have spoken about universal food security system. Now, we have not defined, the advocates of a universal food security system, in my humble opinion, have totally failed to define what is universal. If by universal we mean everybody, the last person, should have food and nutrition security. Of course, that is unobjectionable. There can be no two opinions about it. But if you give up targeting, does it mean that somebody like K.R. Venugopal also should get rice at 2 rupees? Or an MLA should get food at 1 rupee per kilogram? Now, I think we need to be very clear about this, because if we challenge the whole idea of targeting, not targeting properly the people in the PDS, the food security, is an administrative failure, madam. It is a governance failure. You should improve governance. In any case, identifying the poor, I wish to respectfully disagree with you when you said it's very difficult to identify the poor. Madam, if you can't identify the poor in this country, what else will be identified? And as you and I agree, 20 crore people go to bed hungry. Madam, that was exactly the figure in 1995 when I retired. 16% of our population. Nothing has changed. Therefore, all the points that you mentioned are absolutely irrelevant. I'm glad, madam, you started, but I got a little disappointed when you started by saying public distribution is not all about food security. Of course, that's true. But later on, if you go trace your own speech through, since it will be recorded, you will ultimately, I found, you highlighted public distribution system so much that how important it is. Madam, if there is no PDS, there will be no farmer in India. There will be no MSP in India. There will be no Food Corporation of India. There will be no state responsibility in India for the food and nutrition security of the poor people. The PDS is the alternate market, madam, for the poor, who stand banished from the market. Not only those 20 crores, another 20 crores would be. So PDS is the alternative market in India. That should be protected. And for these few points which I mentioned may also be taken care of. And I am very grateful for Mr. Vinay Kumar having intimated me that you would be speaking. I welcome this. And thank you very much indeed. This is a subject which you so passionately spoke about. And as Mr. Vinay Kumar said, that's been my lifeblood. But one would need much more time, but I should abstain in saying more and leave the rest and thanks to you. Thank you, all of you, and you particularly.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Comrade Vinay garu, Kiran Moghe garu, K.R. Venugopal garu. Kiran Moghe garu చాలా విషయాలు చెప్పారు ఆహార భద్రతకు సంబంధించి. మౌలికంగా ఆహార భద్రత అనేది మానవ ప్రాథమిక హక్కులకు సంబంధించినటువంటి అంశం. నిజానికి ఫండమెంటల్ రైట్స్ లో చూసినప్పుడు విద్య, ఆహారం, ఇతర ప్రాథమిక వనరులు ఎంత కీలకమో ఆహారం కూడా అంతే కీలకం. కానీ మానవ జాతి గత 100-150 సంవత్సరాలుగా అనేక ప్రగతిలోకి వెళ్ళడం జరిగింది. అంటే మనం 1961-66లో కనుక చూస్తే అప్పుడు ఈ ఆకలి అనేది అత్యంత తీవ్రంగా ఉన్నటువంటి పరిస్థితి. ఐక్యరాజ్య సమితి కూడా లక్షలాది మంది ఆకలితో ఉన్నట్టు దానికి పరిష్కారం చేయాలి అని చెప్పని అనేక దేశాలకు సూచనలు చేయడం జరిగింది. ఈ ఆహార భద్రత అనేది అదొక చారిత్రకమైనటువంటి అంశం, అది అత్యంత కీలకమైనటువంటిది. దేశవ్యాప్తంగా అనేక ఉద్యమాలు దీనికి వ్యతిరేకంగా జరిగాయి. 1966 తర్వాత ప్రజా పంపిణీ వ్యవస్థను ఏర్పాటు చేయడం జరిగింది. ఎవరైతే లాభోక్తలు ఉన్నారో ఆ లాభోక్తలకు ఆహారం అందించడం కొరకు ప్రయత్నాలు చేశారు. కానీ ఇక్కడ దారిద్ర్య రేఖకు దిగువన ఎవరున్నారు అని చెప్పని నిర్ణయించడంలోనే అనేక ఇబ్బందులు జరుగుతూ ఉన్నాయి. ఇప్పటికీ కూడా బీపీఎల్ కింద ఉన్నవారు ఎవరు అని చెప్పినటువంటి స్పష్టత లేదు. అసలు కొంతమంది ఇప్పుడు టెండూల్కర్ కమిటీ ఉంటే అది 37% అని చెప్తారు. అలాగే ఇతర కమిషన్స్ 50% అని 75% అని చెప్తూ ఉంటారు. అట్లాగే 2015-16లో అనీమియా అప్పుడు వచ్చినటువంటి గణాంక లెక్కల ప్రకారం పౌష్టికాహార లోపం వల్ల 20 కోట్ల మంది ఇబ్బందులకు గురవుతున్నట్టు గణాంకాలు చెప్తూ ఉన్నాయి. అంగన్వాడీలు ఏర్పాటు చేశారు, కొంత మేరకు ఉపయోగపడ్డ. మొత్తం మీద ఏమిటంటే గర్భిణీ మహిళలకు, తర్వాత చిన్నపిల్లలకు పౌష్టికాహార లోపం అనేది చాలా పెద్దగా ఉంది. వ్యయానికి తగినటువంటి మన వయసుకు తగినటువంటి బరువు లేకపోవడం 21% మంది. అలాగే ప్రపంచంలోనే ఈ పౌష్టికాహార లోపం వల్ల చాలా ఇబ్బందులు పడుతున్నటువంటి పరిస్థితిని మనం చూస్తూ ఉన్నాం. 117 దేశాలలో, అందులో దక్షిణాసియా దేశాలలో ముఖ్యంగా ఏమిటంటే బంగ్లాదేశ్, పాకిస్తాన్ ఇలాంటి దేశాలలో కూడా పౌష్టికాహార లోపం వల్ల ఇబ్బందులు పడుతున్నటువంటి పరిస్థితిని మనం చూస్తూ ఉన్నాం. కంప్లీట్ ఆహారం, పూర్తి ఆహారం అంటే పౌష్టికాహారంతో కలిగినటువంటి ఆహారం లభ్యం కావడం లేదు. ముఖ్యంగా పుట్టినప్పటి నుంచి 3 సంవత్సరాల్లో పిల్లలు తగినటువంటి ఆహారం లేకపోవడం, గర్భిణీ స్త్రీలకు కూడా తగినటువంటి ఆహారం అందుబాటులో లేకపోవడం జరుగుతూ ఉంది. అందుకోసం గర్భిణీ స్త్రీలకు సంబంధించి కొన్ని అంగన్వాడీ కేంద్రాలు కొన్ని పథకాలు పెట్టినప్పటికీ వాళ్ళకు తగినటువంటి ఆహారం మాత్రం లభ్యం కావడం లేదు. అలాగే FCIని 1982లో ఏర్పాటు చేశారు. అది ఏర్పాటు చేసిన తర్వాత నిత్యావసర సరుకుల పంపిణీ బాధ్యతను తీసుకుంది 1961-64 మధ్య కాలంలోనే, 1990లో. కానీ ఈ ఆహార పంపిణీ విషయానికి వచ్చినప్పుడు ఏంటంటే క్రమంగా నిత్యావసరకులన్నీ తగ్గించేసి ఒక బియ్యం గోధుమలు మాత్రమే సరఫరా చేసేటటువంటి పరిస్థితికి వచ్చింది. ఈ సరళీకృత ఆర్థిక విధానాలు వచ్చిన తర్వాత 1995 నుండి సరళీకృత ఆర్థిక విధానాలు వచ్చిన తర్వాత ఈ ఆహార భద్రత కొరకు అనేక ఉద్యమాలు, అనేక పోరాటాలు జరిగినాయి. యూపీ 2లో ఈ ఆహార భద్రతకు సంబంధించినటువంటి ఒక చట్టం చేయడం జరిగింది. అది 2013 జూలై 5న ఆహార భద్రతా చట్టాన్ని తీసుకురావడం జరిగింది. సోనియా గాంధీ, తర్వాత రిజర్వ్ బ్యాంక్ మాజీ చైర్మన్ రంగరాజన్ ఆధ్వర్యంలో వాళ్ళు అప్పుడు ఆహార భద్రతా చట్టాన్ని తెచ్చారు. 52 సెక్షన్లతో 3 షెడ్యూల్స్తో ఒక ఆహార భద్రతా చట్టాన్ని తీసుకురావడం జరిగింది. ప్రతి మనిషికి 5 కేజీల బియ్యం లేదా ముతక ధాన్యం, గోధుమలు ఇవ్వాలని, అలాగే అంత్యోదయ అన్న యోజన కింద 35 కేజీల బియ్యం ఇవ్వాలని, గర్భవతులకు 6 మాసాల నుండి ప్రసవం తర్వాత వరకు భోజనం ఏర్పాటు చేయాలని, అలాగే ప్రసూతి అలవెన్స్ 6,000 రూపాయలు ఇవ్వాలని, తర్వాత 6 మాసాలు నుండి 3 సంవత్సరాల వరకు నెలకు 500 క్యాలరీల శక్తి గల ఆహారం అందించాలని, 3-6 సంవత్సరాల మధ్యలో ఉన్న వాళ్ళకు ఉదయం స్నాక్స్, అలాగే వేడి ఉడకబెట్టినటువంటి అన్నం. దాంతో పాటు ఏంటంటే 6 మాసాల నుండి 6 సంవత్సరాల వరకు 800 క్యాలరీల శక్తి గల ఆహారం, 20-25 గ్రాములు పౌష్టికాహారం, అలాగే వండిన అన్నంతో పాటు 600 క్యాలరీల శక్తి గల ఆహారాన్ని అందించాలని చెప్పని చట్టంలో చెప్పడం జరిగింది. కానీ ఇదేమి 2009 యూపీఏ 2 తర్వాత ఇది అమలు జరగలేదు. మోడీ ప్రభుత్వం అమలు చేయడంలో చాలా డిలే చేయడం జరిగింది. ముఖ్యంగా BPL విషయానికి వచ్చినప్పుడు ఏమిటంటే BPL నిర్ణయం స్పష్టత లేకపోవడం వల్ల ఏమిటంటే ఏదో కొంతమంది ఈ FCI వల్ల PDS పంపిణీ కొంత చేయడం జరుగుతున్నప్పటికీ అది సక్రమంగా అవసరమైనటువంటి వాళ్లకు, నీడీ పర్సన్స్ కు అందడం అనేది జరగడం లేదు. ఈ మధ్య మోడీ ప్రభుత్వం వచ్చిన తర్వాత శాంతకుమార్ కమిటీ చేశారు. అది 3 చట్టాలను 3 చట్టాలను రికమెండ్ చేసింది. ఆ 3 చట్టాలను మోడీ ఇప్పుడు ఆమోదించాడు. అందులో ముఖ్యంగా FCIకి సంబంధించి శాంతకుమార్ చేసినటువంటి రికమెండేషన్స్ లో రాష్ట్రాలకే నగదు బదిలీని ఏర్పాటు చేసి రాష్ట్రాలే ఆహార ధాన్యాలు కొనుగోలు చేసేటట్టు చేసి కేంద్రం యొక్క బాధ్యత నుంచి తప్పించాలనే ప్రయత్నం చేశారు. దాంతో పాటు ఏమిటంటే ఈ 3 కొత్త చట్టాలను రంగంలోకి తీసుకురావడం జరిగింది. అందులో మొదటి చట్టం ఏమిటంటే మార్కెట్ రద్దు చట్టం. ఈ మార్కెట్ రద్దు చట్టం వల్ల ఏమిటంటే గవర్నమెంట్ సేకరణ పోయి ప్రైవేట్ వాళ్ళ సేకరణ జరుగుతుంది. అందుకోసం ప్రైవేట్ వాళ్ళ సేకరణ జరిగినప్పుడు ఏమిటంటే మనకు తగినటువంటి పీడిఎస్లో కావాల్సినటువంటి ఆహార ధాన్యాల లభ్యత సక్రమంగా ఉండదు. ఇప్పటికీ పీడిఎస్ కింద ఎఫ్సిఐ వాళ్ళకు ఉన్నటువంటి నార్మ్స్ ఏమిటంటే 1,12,00,000 టన్నుల ఆహార బియ్యం, మరొక 1,20,00,000 టన్నులు గోధుమలు, మొత్తం 2,45,00,000 టన్నులు నిల్వలు ఉండాలనేది లక్ష్యం. కానీ ఈరోజు దానికి మించి 7 కోట్ల టన్నుల ఆహార ధాన్యాలు ఎఫ్సిఐలో నిల్వ ఉన్నప్పటికీ వాటిని సరి అయినటువంటి పంపిణీ చేయడం లేదు. అందువల్ల ఏంటంటే ఈ మార్కెట్ల రద్దు చట్టం కనుక వస్తే అది ప్రైవేటు వ్యాపారస్తుల చేతిలోకి వెళ్ళిపోతుంది. ఇప్పుడు ఉన్నటువంటి కొద్ది ఆహార భద్రత కూడా లేకుండా పోతుందని చెప్పనేది ఒకటి. రెండవ చట్టం ఏంటంటే కాంట్రాక్ట్ ఫార్మింగ్. కాంట్రాక్ట్ ఫార్మింగ్ ఏంటంటే కంపెనీలు ఉత్పత్తి చేయడం, సేకరించడం, తర్వాత వాళ్ళు ఒకే పంటను అంటే మోనోక్రాప్ను పెట్టడం జరుగుతుంది. బహుళ జాతి పంటలు లేకుండా పోయి మోనోక్రాప్ను పెట్టడం జరుగుతుంది. ఈ మోనోక్రాప్ వల్ల ఏమిటంటే ఎగుమతి ఆధారిత పంటలే పండిస్తారు. ఆహార ధాన్యాల పంటల మీద ఈ కార్పొరేట్ సంస్థలు నిరాసక్తత చూపుతాయి. అందువల్ల ఇప్పటికే మనం ఆహార ధాన్యాలు దిగుమతి చేసుకుంటున్నాం. ఎడిబుల్ ఆయిల్స్ 1,30,00,000 టన్నులు, మరొక 50,00,000 టన్నులు పప్పు ధాన్యాలు, మరొక 40,00,000 టన్నులు పంచదార, అలాగే పత్తి, ఇట్లా వ్యవసాయ ఉత్పత్తులు, జీడిపప్పు, సెరీల్స్, ముతక ధాన్యాలకు సంబంధించినటువంటి ఉత్పత్తులు కూడా మనం 3 లక్షల కోట్ల విలువ గల ఆహార ధాన్యాలను ఇతర దేశాల నుంచి దిగుమతి చేసుకోవాల్సినటువంటి పరిస్థితి ఏర్పడింది. అదే 1995లో కానీ చూస్తే మన దేశం ఆహార ధాన్యాలలో స్వయం పోషకత్వంగా ఉంది. దాని తర్వాత ఏంటంటే క్రమంగా మోనోక్రాప్ సిస్టమ్ వచ్చిన తర్వాత, అంటే ఒకే పంట విధానం వచ్చిన తర్వాత క్రమంగా ఆహార ధాన్యాల యొక్క ఉత్పత్తి తగ్గడం, ఇతర దేశాల దిగుమతులపైన ఆధారపడి ఉండేటటువంటి పరిస్థితికి మనం నెట్టబడ్డాం. మూడవ చట్టం ఈ నిత్యావసర సరుకుల చట్టం. ఈ నిత్యావసర సరుకుల చట్టంలో సెరీల్స్ అంటే ముతక ధాన్యాలు, ఆయిల్ సీడ్స్, ఆలు, ఉల్లి, తర్వాత ఇట్లాంటి నిత్యావసర సరుకులు ఏవైతే ఉన్నాయో వీటి మీద ఉన్నటువంటి ఆంక్షలు తొలగించడం జరిగింది. ఈ ఆంక్షలు తొలగించడంతో వ్యాపారస్తులు ఎంతైనా సరుకులు నిల్వబెట్టుకోవడం, బ్లాక్ మార్కెట్ చేయడం, ధరలు పెంచడం జరుగుతుంది. ఇది ఇప్పటికే మనకు ఏర్పడుతూ ఉంది. మనం పప్పు ధాన్యాలు కానీ చూస్తే ఈ చట్టం రద్దయిన 1 నెల రోజుల్లోనే కేజీ 65 రూపాయల నుండి పప్పులు 130 రూపాయలకు పెరగడం జరిగింది. అలాగే ఉల్లి 20 రూపాయల నుంచి 80 రూపాయలకు పెరగడం జరిగింది. అలాగే వంట నూనెల ధరలు కూడా 120-130 రూపాయల వరకు కేజీకి పెరగడం జరిగింది. అందువల్ల నిల్వలు పెట్టుకొని ఎక్కువ ఈ లాభాలు సంపాదించడానికి కార్పొరేట్ సంస్థలు తీవ్రమైనటువంటి ప్రయత్నం చేసేటటువంటి పరిస్థితి కొనసాగుతున్నది. అందులో ఈ 3 చట్టాలు కనుక ఇప్పుడు అమలు జరిగితే అత్యంత తీవ్రమైనటువంటి పరిస్థితులు ఏర్పడతాయని చెప్పని కిరణ్ మోగే గారు చెప్పారు. వాస్తవం కూడా అదే జరగబోతుంది. మళ్ళా రైతుల పోరాటం ఏదైతే ఉందో దీనికి అందరూ మద్దతు తెలియజేయాలని చెప్పని కూడా తెలియపరచడం జరిగింది. ముఖ్యంగా ఆహార భద్రతకు సంబంధించి రైతులు ఆహార ధాన్యాల ఉత్పత్తి చేయడానికి తగినటువంటి వనరులను ప్రభుత్వాలు ఏర్పాటు చేయాలి. కానీ మోడీ ప్రభుత్వం అందుకు సుముఖంగా లేదు. మనం గతంలో వెనక్కు కనుక వెళ్ళి చూస్తే 1965లో మనం ఆహార ధాన్యాలు దిగుమతి చేసుకుంటున్నటువంటి పరిస్థితి. ఆ తర్వాత హరిత విప్లవ కాలంలో మనం బ్యాంకులు జాతీయం చేసి విత్తనాలలో మార్పులు తీసుకొచ్చి ఆ విధంగా ఉత్పత్తిని, ఉత్పాదకతను 5 రెట్లు పెంచుకోవడం జరిగింది. అలాగే జనాభా 3 రెట్లు పెరిగిన 5 రెట్లు పెరిగినటువంటి ఆహార ధాన్యాల వల్ల మనం అన్ని రంగాలలో ఆహార ఉత్పత్తుల్లో మిగులు సాధించి ఎగుమతులు చేసినటువంటి పరిస్థితికి చేరుకున్నాం. ఆ విధంగా భారతదేశం 100 కోట్ల జనాభా ఉన్నటువంటిది మనం ఎగుమతులు చేసేటటువంటి స్థితికి వచ్చిన తర్వాత అప్పుడు ఈ న్యూ సరళీకృత విధానాలు వచ్చి మన ఉత్పత్తులను దెబ్బతీసేటటువంటి క్రమం పెద్ద ఎత్తున కొనసాగింది. అందులో భాగంగా ఏంటంటే ఇప్పుడు మనం దిగుమతుల మీద ఆధారపడేటటువంటి పరిస్థితికి వచ్చాం. ఇప్పుడు ముఖ్యంగా ఏమిటంటే మనం ఇతర దేశాల యొక్క ఫ్యాక్టరీలకు కావాల్సినటువంటి ముడి సరుకులను ఉత్పత్తి చేయడం, తర్వాత ఇతర దేశాల నుంచి మనం ఆహార ధాన్యాలు దిగుమతి చేసుకోవడం జరుగుతున్నదే తప్ప అసలు ఆహార భద్రత అంటే ఏమిటి, పౌష్టికాహారం అందరికీ కల్పించడం, ఈ 2013 చట్టం ఏదైతుందో ఆ చట్టాన్ని అమలు చేసేటటువంటి పరిస్థితి మనం కల్పించాలి. కానీ మోడీ ప్రభుత్వం ఈ 2013 ఆహార భద్రతా చట్టాన్ని అమలు చేసేటటువంటి పరిస్థితి కనబడడం లేదు. అందులో ఇంకొకటి ఏంటంటే ఈ గ్రామీణ ప్రాంతంలో దాదాపు 75% మంది ప్రజలు, పట్టణ ప్రాంతాలలో 55% మంది ప్రజలు బీపీఎల్ అంటే పౌష్టికాహార లోపంతో ఇబ్బందులు పడుతున్నటువంటి పరిస్థితి కొనసాగుతున్నది. రక్తహీనతతోటి, అమీబియాతోటి అనేక ఇబ్బందులు పడుతూ ఉన్నారు. కనీసం వాళ్ళకి ఏదైనా చిన్న జబ్బు వచ్చినా రెసిస్టెన్స్ పవర్ అంటే వాళ్ళ శరీరం ప్రతిఘటించేటటువంటి పద్ధతి లేనటువంటి పరిస్థితిని మనం చూస్తూ ఉన్నాం. అందువల్ల ఏంటంటే ప్రాథమిక హక్కుగా ఉన్నటువంటి ఆహార భద్రతను కల్పించడంలో ప్రభుత్వాలు, ముఖ్యంగా మనం భారత ప్రభుత్వం, మోడీ ప్రభుత్వం అంత శ్రద్ధ చూపడం లేదనేది స్పష్టమవుతుంది. అలాగే మానవ హక్కులకు సంబంధించి కూడా సక్రమంగా అమలు జరగడం లేదు. ఇప్పటికీ కూడా 2012లో కానీ మనం చూస్తే ఆకలి అనేది అత్యంత దుర్మార్గంగా ఉంది. గతంలో మనం బెంగాల్ కరువును చూసాం. ఆ తర్వాత ఏంటంటే గుంటూరులో కూడా కరువు వచ్చి దాదాపు 30,000 మంది చనిపోయారు. బెంగాల్ కరువు అనేది ప్రపంచ చరిత్రలో రాయబడినటువంటిది. అట్లాంటి కరువు నుంచి మనం బయటపడి మన ఉత్పత్తిని పెంచుకున్న తర్వాత ఇప్పటికీ కూడా ఏమిటంటే మనం అందరికీ ఆహార పీడిఎస్ ద్వారా, పబ్లిక్ డిస్ట్రిబ్యూషన్ సిస్టమ్ చౌకడిపోల ద్వారా ఆహార ధాన్యాలను పంపిణీ చేయడంలో లోపం అనేది కొనసాగుతున్నది. ఈ ఆహారం అనేది, వ్యవసాయం అనేది షెడ్యూల్ 2లో ఉన్నప్పటికీ ముఖ్యంగా ఏమిటంటే రాష్ట్రాల యొక్క బాధ్యత చాలా కీలకంగా ఉంది. అందువల్ల ఎలాంటి షరతులు లేకుండా ఆహార భద్రత కల్పించేటటువంటి చర్యలు చేపట్టాలి. ముఖ్యంగా ఏంటంటే ఆహారం అంటే ఏదో మనం ఆకలి కోసం తినడం కాకుండా రక్తహీనత కానీ, జబ్బులను తట్టుకునే శక్తి కానీ కలిగేటట్టు మనం కనీసం 2400 క్యాలరీల శక్తి గల ఆహారాన్ని రోజు తీసుకోవాలి. కానీ ఈ రోజు కానీ లెక్క చూస్తే ఏంటంటే 1700-1600 క్యాలరీల శక్తి గల ఆహారాన్ని మనం తీసుకోవడం జరుగుతుంది. అందుకోసం రోగ నిరోధక శక్తి లేకపోవడం, మనకు పుట్టేటటువంటి పిల్లలు, అలాగే బరువుకు వయసు తగినటువంటి బరువు లేకపోవడం, గర్భిణీ స్త్రీలు రక్తహీనతతో ఇబ్బందులు పడడం అనేది మనం చూస్తూ ఉన్నాం. అలాగే పురుషులలో కూడా వాళ్ళ యొక్క ఎదుగుదల అంత పెద్దగా కనబడడం లేదు. కాబట్టి దక్షిణ ఆసియా దేశాలలో ఉన్నటువంటి పరిస్థితే కాకుండా భారతదేశంలో ఉన్నటువంటి వనరుల రీత్యా ఇప్పుడు ఆహార భద్రత అనేది అత్యంత కీలకంగా మనం చూడాల్సినటువంటి పరిస్థితి ఉంది. అలాగే రాష్ట్ర ఆహార కమిషన్ వేశారు, ఒక చైర్మన్ మరో 4గురితో కలిపి. అలాగే రాష్ట్ర స్థాయి ఎక్కువ రాష్ట్రాలలో ఈ కమిషన్లు వేయడం జరిగింది. ఇందులో ఆహార పంపిణీలో మహిళలకు అధికారం ఉండాలని చెప్పని, అలాగే గ్రీవియన్స్ మెకానిజం ఒకటి ఉండాలని, దీన్ని సక్రమంగా అమలు జరగకపోతే జరిమానాలు విధించాలని చెప్పని చట్టంలో చెప్పడం జరిగింది. కానీ యాక్చువల్గా ఇది అమలు జరగడం లేదు. అసలు ఈ చట్టాన్నే అమలు చేసేటటువంటి స్థితిలో ఈరోజు మోడీ ప్రభుత్వం లేదు. దానికి తోడుగా ఏమిటంటే ఆహార భద్రతను దెబ్బతీసే విధంగా 3 వ్యవసాయ చట్టాలను, ఒకటి మార్కెట్ల రద్దు, 2 కాంట్రాక్టు కార్పొరేట్ వ్యవసాయం, 3వది నిత్యావసర సరుకుల చట్టం సవరణ, ఈ 3 చట్టాలు తెచ్చి దేశంలో ఆహార భద్రతను లేకుండా చేయడం జరిగింది. ఈ మధ్య కోవిడ్ లో మనం చూసాం, కోవిడ్ లో రెసిస్టెన్స్ పవర్ లేక చాలా మంది చనిపోవడం చూసాం. అలాగే దాదాపు 19 కోట్ల మంది పట్టణాల నుంచి గ్రామాలకు వలసలు వెళ్ళిపోవడం, వాళ్ళందరూ గ్రామీణ వ్యవసాయం మీద ఆధారపడేటటువంటి పరిస్థితి ఏర్పడింది. ఇప్పటికీ కూడా గ్రామీణ ప్రాంతంలో సరి అయినటువంటి పౌష్టికాహారం లేదు. అలాగే పట్టణాలలో కూడా ఆదాయ వనరులు కూడా తగ్గిపోయినాయి. ఈ ఆదాయ వనరులు తగ్గిపోవడంతో పౌష్టికాహారం తీసుకోవడానికి తగినటువంటి వనరులు కూడా తగ్గిపోవడం జరుగుతుంది దానితో పాటు. అందువల్ల ఏమిటంటే ఆహార భద్రత అనేది ప్రతి వ్యక్తికి ఉండాల్సినటువంటి ప్రాథమిక హక్కు. ఆ హక్కును అమలు చేయడానికి రాష్ట్ర కేంద్ర ప్రభుత్వాలు ఇవి తగినటువంటి ప్రణాళికలు రూపొందించడమే కాకుండా ముఖ్యంగా 14 సంవత్సరాల వరకు వయసు ఉన్నటువంటి పిల్లలకు, గర్భిణీ స్త్రీలకు, మహిళలకు, అలాగే శారీరక శ్రమ చేసేటటువంటి వాళ్లకు కావలసినటువంటి పౌష్టికాహారం అందించడానికి తగినటువంటి వనరులు ఏర్పాటు చేయాలి. దానికి తగినటువంటి నిధులు కేంద్ర రాష్ట్ర ప్రభుత్వాలు విడుదల చేయాలి. ముఖ్యంగా కేంద్ర ప్రభుత్వం మీద ప్రధాన బాధ్యత. ఇప్పుడు శాంతకుమార్ కమిటీ చెప్పిన దాని ప్రకారం FCIని రద్దు చేశారు. దాదాపుగా ఇప్పటికీ అది సేకరణ అనేది 2 సంవత్సరాల నుంచి విరమించుకోవడం జరిగింది. క్రమంగా ఏంటంటే కార్పొరేట్ సంస్థలకే ఆహార భద్రతను కూడా అప్పచెప్పే ప్రయత్నం కనుక చేస్తే అసలు ఇప్పుడున్నటువంటి కొద్ది గొప్ప ఆహార భద్రత కూడా లేకుండా పోయేటటువంటి ప్రమాదం ఉంటుంది. ఆహార ధాన్యాల ధరలు బాగా పెరిగిపోతాయి. వాళ్ళ కొనుగోలు శక్తికి మించి పెరగడం చేత కనీసం వాళ్ళ అవసరం మేరకు కొనుగోలు చేసేటటువంటి పరిస్థితి కూడా లేకుండా పోతుంది. అందువల్ల దేశంలో ఈ ఆహార భద్రతా చట్టాన్ని అమలు చేయడంతో పాటు ఆయా వయస్సుల వారికి తగినటువంటి శక్తి కలగడానికి, వాళ్ళకున్నటువంటి రోగ నిరోధక శక్తిని పెంచడానికి, తగిన క్యాలరీల శక్తిని వచ్చేటటువంటి విధంగా ఆహార భద్రత చట్టం కల్పించాలి. PDS ను యూనివర్సలైజేషన్ చేయాలి. ఏదో కొద్ది మందికి పరిమితం చేయడం కాకుండా మొత్తం అందరికీ కూడా ఒకటే ధర నిర్ణయించేసి యూనివర్సలైజేషన్ చేయాలి. ఈ ద్వంద్వ ధరల విధానం ఉండడం వల్ల, అంటే చౌకడి పొలకు ఒక ధర, ఓపెన్ మార్కెట్ లో ఒక ధర ఉండడం వల్ల బ్లాక్ మార్కెట్ అనేది పెద్దగా జరుగుతుంది. అందుకోసం ఈ PDS అనేది యూనివర్సల్ గా ఉంటే బ్లాక్ మార్కెట్ అనేది నెట్టుకున్నా పోతుంది. దానివల్ల ప్రభుత్వం మీద పడే పెద్ద భారం కూడా ఏమి ఉండదు. ఇప్పటికే దాదాపు 70 నుంచి 80% ప్రజలు PDS కింద ఆహారం తీసుకుంటున్నారు. ఇంకా మహా అయితే ఇంకొక 20% మంది వాళ్ళకి అవసరమైనటువంటి తీసుకుంటారు తప్ప PDS అనే పేరుతో ఈ పెద్ద ఒత్తిడి కలిగేటటువంటి పరిస్థితి ఏమి ఉండదు. అందువల్ల మన దేశీయ ఉత్పత్తులలో మోనోక్రాప్ సిస్టమ్ కాకుండా పౌష్టికాహారానికి సంబంధించినటువంటి ఉత్పత్తులను ఉత్పత్తి చేయడం, అలాగే వ్యవసాయ రంగం లాభదాయకంగా ఉండడం, ఆ బహుళ పంటల విధానాన్ని ప్రోత్సహించడం, చౌక డిపోలను సక్రమంగా నిర్వహించడం, ఆహార భద్రతా చట్టాన్ని సక్రమంగా అమలు చేసేటటువంటి చర్యలు చేపట్టాలి. అప్పుడు మాత్రమే దేశంలో ఈ ఆహార భద్రత ఉంటుంది అని చెప్పనేది తెలియపరచడం జరుగుతున్నది. సో థ్యాంక్స్.
మల్లారెడ్డి గారు థ్యాంక్స్, ధన్యవాదాలు.